Hello everyone, today we talk again about classical antiquity and ancient religion, looking at similarities and differences between the Hellenic and Roman way to tradition. In the past month, since last summer roughly, I started this sort of series within the series. You don't see all these machinations behind the topic choice, but to reinforce a little bit more like the backbone of the foundational, traditional, spiritual history of the ancient world, and in particular, of course, like those cultures that impacted it the most in a broader sense. I don't have to tell you that, of course, I have like all the history of religion, history of theology, history of tradition, etc. playlists. We talk a lot about Indo-Europeans. We stuck very much to some of the sort of foundational aspects of these traditions. We also recently began to discuss the Hermetic one as well in later history. Just today I was preparing another video on that, and I was realizing how openly even, for example, Christian sources speak of the same identical theology that what, because what my point is that they were actually talking about the same identical Catholic tradition. At most, there were Gnostic heresies that were basically continuing the sort of distortions of the great civilization of the Mother, with their Pelagian ectonic dimension, that however was still functional for the conquerors and the rulers, and how again we somehow still approach, at least in pop culture, these topics as the Romans, the Greeks, as some isolated peoples that had their own kind of, categorically, not even necessarily inward, but still fundamentally just that people's set of views that had nothing to do with the others, and or like you cannot generalize because there was a diversity in religion, whatever. And the more I go on after studying this for many years, I come to the realization that we have completely and systematically misportrayed that. It's not merely the fact that we forgot, of course, at some point along the way, what this thing was all about for real, but there is a very specifically ideological agenda to say, like even an unconscious one to a degree, right? Because this is the depth of the spiritual issue here. It's not like somebody, created at some point. There were also, surely, in the educational system at some point in history, some deliberate choices to purge the curricula, for example, from this more traditional revival and historical understanding, religious understanding. I will not talk about this. If anything, it could be an interesting theme for another video. But it's obvious that when we get to the Romans and the Greeks, we are looking at peoples that left not much just an indelible mark in the history of world civilization, but that fundamentally keep pioneering it in its legacy. Right? I don't even have to remind you of the Holy Roman Empire and why people still somehow stick to legalism or essentially just modernistic pop cultural sort of memes or whatever into determining what is Roman, as opposed to have an actually highly cultured kind of background to draw from. Let's leave this aside as well. However, Hellas comes before Rome in different ways at least, and across the ancient Hellenic philosophy, you can perceive what we have already modeled, like we have already described, for example, in the videos about the Dorians and recently also about the Olympians, as a very particular concept. It is to say the highest form of perfection lay not in physical substances, but in the complete actualization of an entity's inherent essence or true nature, right? This is very interesting because indeed it is perfectly part of the doctrine of the two natures. There is an archetype and there is a sublimation. In fact, a true divine transfiguration of every being. And this is a concept that comes straight from the same mold, not just of the Indo-European forefathers, but of the entire ancient Catholic tradition worldwide. Obviously, if you don't know what I mean by that, watch my videos because I already answered there. I don't need to do it again, right? We're not criticizing here the Hellenic perspective, if not in a neutral sense, meaning why Hellenic culture, especially also the classical one, as we will see now, mostly talking about Plato, Aristotle, etc., described us. Because even in those philosophies, of course, there are very important differences and interpretations and takes. So what we're doing this is for the sake of a diachronic and comparative history of religions, right, of Indo-Europeans, and observing also the same theological matters through the lens of peoples that had, objectively at this point, very different history. We already made lots of content explaining how the Hellenes, for example, had a greater stratification, that, again, Byzantine crystallization that we highlight also in our medieval history videos does derive from this greater continuity of Hellenic culture that at that point becomes also more, as successful as it had been, becomes more reactionary in a sense. Whereas Rome was much more recent, but in this sense also endowed with a much more primitive and ancestral, really, view of world domination and how this had to be divinely attained. Right? The extreme, paradoxically, is the fact that it's not much even a philosophical, theological misconception in the Greek world, but if anything, the level of attainment of the same people, which, as you know, in the history of tradition are basically just degenerating as long as they remain in the lower nature. It's not a historical take, it's truly a metaphysical take, right? If you're not part of it, it comes from the doctrine of assumed natures, being and becoming. If you are fixed in heaven, partaking the divine order, there is a struggle in the end time and so on, but at least you're fixed to a degree and you have already done a consistent part of the job. If you're in the lower nature, eternally degenerating. I mean, the lower nature exists because as a degeneration, as a continuous becoming towards the negative. It can actually succeed in coming back to the one, into a higher state, but it's completely normal in the history of religion and civilization to see this from a spiritual point of view, in a spiritually qualitative point of view. It's not like even civilization has ever less power, as a matter of fact, but in relation to broader sort of world control, and even considering the potential at its disposal, it makes an ever more sorrowful use of that. The paradox is for example, from a military historical point of view that interests us, as we talk often about Hellenic classical warfare, is how Thucydides conceptualizes discipline, right? We talked about the Olympians, Athena, we've seen there how we will historicize it too much, why also Hellenic civilization developed in particular those figures. It's also a matter of relative debate. We will, if anything, make other videos on that. Thucydides basically reaches this level of absolute abstraction of discipline, right? He thinks, because he was truly thinking as a Greek, as a Ptolemy, for example, that would calculate the entire coordinates of world's locations and would not even draw a map, as a matter of fact. Well, this is what the Greeks do. They idealize, they conceptualize, they abstract an idea that is truly very intelligent, is genial, right? It's intellectually superior, because that's what the Greeks will always maintain, after all, even when they were under the Romans. But it sort of abstracts from actual application, right? Thucydides basically tells us that if you would have simply pursued discipline, that in that sense is understood as a higher Olympian ideal of essentially divine order. If you study von Clausewitz, basically the way he describes his theory of absolute warfare for the sake of, not as a straw man, but as a theoretical example, is fundamentally that. It's the same thing. The Romans would have never, however, absolutized the concept of discipline, because they realized that they were operating in a human dimension. And so, yes, they had to divinely transcend themselves, but they knew that discipline alone, aside from the fact that obviously they had different words, and to an extent we will never understand how they actually thought. I mean, the Romans didn't even have a word for strategy, and they conquered the world with the best military. If anything, they hadn't secularized or modernized the concept of virtus, right? That essentially entailed like that kind of grander achievement that was still, if you want, even in a more in a later and relatively more modern secular time in Roman history, the one after the sagas, when the Romans had started probably to write fully fledged historiography, was more a contrast between, in fact, those two tensions, between the pure action, right, deriving also from sort of time spent contemplating, preparing, military, and so on, but living as a true warrior, and the imposition of discipline also on mostly on the lower strata of society, the plebeians. Think about the Camillian reforms, the cooptation of the people properly, which was not quite a thing, at least with the same sort of elevation to specific civic rights as it was the case in previous feudal Rome. In that sense, Marius didn't really invent anything, and just sort of reached that to try full legal opening to the recruitment mechanism. It was an obvious consequence of how things were going. In any case, from a political and social point of view, didn't even genially reform anything. The Roman army was just what it was already, even without him. All topics, again, that if you're familiar with and you have followed me, our daily bread here, right? The Romans understood that there couldn't be this military virtue, right? What we could call, in a very banal and denaturated sense, individualism, in a sense, the one of the warrior that fundamentally fights in an egoistic way, right? And so, as we understand as moderns, mostly something that, doesn't contribute to society. Not quite in the sense, because as individualism, as egoism, as warriorism, we mostly see the deterior one that manifested in history and failed against a civic community and collective power already from the time of Rome. But in any historical time telling, because any other model we don't know of, historically speaking, and it's mostly belonging in this people's mythology to the age of gods or demigods. At the end of the day, we know even the Bronze Age, that is age of demigods, that armies fought with that degree of collectivity. But they understood exactly in this sense from Rome that there was always a tension, that you couldn't successfully obtain victory if you didn't blend these two, because of being and becoming, as we said before. And so the necessary meeting point, it would manifest as, in fact, divine glory and world conquest, that the Greeks had basically lost, also because they had never truly or fully embraced that as a broader ideal. Even Alexander conquered the world, but the following empire never fully succeeded in affirming a universal uniformity and conclusion and overall ecumenic coherence, like Rome instead successfully did, also on the footsteps of Alexander, for that matter. So these are very important differences. Recently, we made a video explaining essentially how the Romans had metaphysicized the concept of state, right? Which today also people don't really understand. Of course, there wasn't much the same word at the time. It's a word that came around mostly around the time of Machiavelli in the Renaissance, but that is evident in the metaphysical character of the Roman institution and the difference between regere and imperare, that famously enough is very well, are two very well distinct and respectively positive and negative ways to rule. In Virgil, that expresses also through poetry this very high, in fact, political religion of Rome. And so you see also the depth of it, right? The Romans themselves understood that mere imposition was just the limit of a ruler. And is our old concepts, if you dig into sort of Indo-European religion, etc., are truly originary of these cultures and fully expressing their purest identity. But humanity decays in any case. So by the time we can well document Hellenic Roman culture, things have already changed. And this is valid for any other people. By the way, slightly unrelated, but I discovered that like a couple of years ago on a subreddit of neo-pagans, which I think would be laughable in and of itself by the term. Basically, I don't know what I didn't even read that. I discovered it by chance through Grok, that essentially my video, this was a very old video from I think 2018, 2019, in which I had made a parallelism between the various expressions of Indo-European sacred fury and there was obviously an ignorant person, but just not to be misled yourselves, that was apparently criticizing the fact that I associated virtus with furor, right? Together with others, there is the older Dasacht, the same audacia in Latin. I don't know if they talked about that as well. The meaning being obvious, and as we see in the series about Indo-Europeans, they sort of European theology through linguistics mostly. Different terms vary, just we know this in normal language, but in a sense also the religious concepts attached to them do, right? Because by the time, for example, where the Romans were speaking of the furor for the Germans, for example, or the Gauls, also back in the day, they were specifically referring to more the tier concept compared to virtus. It could have not been otherwise, because the virtus is properly the virtue of the vir. It's the sum of all Roman virtues. It's the truly Catholic accomplishment of the Roman as a man in contact with God. In a pure absolute sense, it was connected with Rome, right? The barbarian was in that sense depicted in ways that actually the Romans would have echoed with in the description of their habits and their warlike culture, the ancient war bands and so on. They were still pretty much alive as if you read Tacitus, it's impossible to unsee the metaphysical sort of concept even of, I don't know, a siege, right? The siege of Jerusalem. You go look at that and read what kind of verbs Tacitus uses to describe, or even just what's the point of it all. It's not even about the technicality of the siege, as a Greek would have been more interested in, for example. It's about the idea of how could they even think they could resist Rome, and how the imperium manifests in basically swallowing the same Jerusalem. It's something beautiful. It's something frightening. It's one of the most beautiful things ever. Like if you look at it through a Roman bloodthirsty, in this sense, properly, truly sacredly connected world and vision. Providence proper. So the fact that people are completely disconnected from it, they can't criticize me by saying, this guy's, I don't know if they claimed it was even an etymological connection. I don't even remember what I said in that video, but I excluded it because I never heard of any of this, and I didn't even care about these people, but just for saying how disconnected. Even the people who allegedly have it, okay, neo-pagans are a joke, let's be honest. Like, you're probably some of the most radically underschooled and social, culturally disadvantaged people in current history, and also because they exist only now with a further degeneration of lesser people and the fourth estate. But the main problem is that they say these things are not even discussed. Like, if you have any sensitivity to any religious topic, you know that there is a point, right, in stating that there is a connection between these ideas, and simply nationalizing terms and pretending that they were different just because you don't like the Romans or something like that, or vice versa, is dumb, right? It belongs to literally lesser people. It belongs to the scum of the earth, people that should be deprived of civic rights, and we're completely uninterested in having any connection with, as a matter of fact. Now, back to the topic. Both Plato and Aristotle, we were hinting at before, portrayed matter, called Hyle, as a domain of indefinite, shifting potential, lacking clear boundaries and stability. If you understand the etymology of Hyle, you know that it refers essentially to firewood. And as we've seen in Indo-European languages, basically the entirety of the vocabulary is connected with, among sort of also the bigger picture even, with the sacred ritual of fire and burning. So the idea is that in this netherworld, the Hyle is the sort of infinite potential inherent, that trace of being that we see in this essentially hologrammically degenerating reality that is never fully being, but has at least in this sense, like this in lack of form, right, that must be given, in this case of the Hyle, through burning, literally as also in a voluntary sense, as a self-sacrificial concept, like mouth in the flame, according to Vedic texts, that confers literally divine form to the non-being, or the eternally becoming in this sort of non-existential plenitude, right? This is incredibly important, because you see that the Greeks themselves these are very important concepts, of course, in Plato and Aristotle's physics, metaphysics. And the fact that the Greeks would insist much of this is fascinating, because this inherent vagueness ensured essentially that any concrete object or living creature could never fully coincide with its own ideal governing form or idea as such, right? In theory, like in potential, they could, right? They were truly modeled after that. And this concept, by the way, bears strong resemblance to the Vedic notion of dharma itself, that we will see also better in other videos. This is incredibly fascinating because, that also in a scientific sense, of course, it was the problem of categories. These are things also famously sort of collected in the Middle Ages, the universals. And so what is this? Like the Greeks were, in exactly because they were more modern and secular, the ones who first thought out the concept of scientific category. Right, an Achaemenid would have seen a tree, it would have said, but that is not just a tree. Like, of course, they understood and they saw that it was something similar to other trees and surely shared some of its capacities, but it was considered still as a thing on its own. The Greeks still understand this, but they are ever more sort of abstracting towards the abstract category. And this is incredibly notorious because, again, Plato and Aristotle are at the root of a great part of the root, at least, of Western philosophy and world descriptive mode. And we inherited, in that philosophical sense, this more sort of distancing, this more skeptical at times, not specifically referring to either Plato or Aristotle in particular, right? But it's something that you see also in modern science that assumes mostly the character of some sort of scientism and of denialism of anything that also nobody really understands how it can be sort of in turn empirically defined, meaning at the end of the day, if you dig back into your sources, how do you even feel? How is your existence or the validity of anything that you can somehow express in an imperfect way expendable, right? Even in a moral, in a scientific sense. Excellence in this Hellenic view required the total embodiment of one's appropriate form, whereas materiality represented nothing more than an intrinsic barrier to such complete fulfillment. Right, and materiality perhaps is not even the better term. It's mostly its instantiation in the lower nature, not its sublimation into a higher condition. So this is important because the Gnostics took off the tangent of separating matter from spirit in a quite Cartesian sense, even though Cartesius had sort of a different sort of approach to that in very different philosophical era for specific also historical reasons. Truly, the sort of the broader nature of a being was understood as inextricably entwining what we, by the sake of sort of simplicity, distinguish between body and soul. All right, this is valid also for what today we would call non-living beings. In a way, I explained this in the traditional meaning of space. Now, from this metaphysical foundation flowed the Hellenic's profound contempt for manual labor, or ponos, which they saw as degrading and punitive, something appropriate only for slaves. This was actually believed by everyone in the past. The fourth estate, in some peoples, is not even an estate. They're not even people, right? And this can pass through sort of different levels of social isolation, subordination. I don't know, even the Celts conquering Central Europe and sort of invading the Mediterranean in more or less the same times of Plato and Aristotle truly thought that they would sow their fields with the tip of their lances, meaning that truly they commanded others in a truly hierarchical and Catholic sense of world domination through their own Holy Ghost, through their grace, and so the manifestation of the imperium as themselves media of the divinity. This was the universal conception. Everybody believed the same identical thing. And indeed, fourth estaters were considered something else. The actual work, not even the third estater technically worked, right? He had wealth and could have other work for him, but he did not engage, at least on a regular, because estates could overlap to a degree, of course, into the more intensive kind of aristocratic military lifestyle and initiation, all mechanisms that remained very much alive, especially for the sake of holy war, also because every war in antiquity was a holy war. There isn't such a thing like wars of religion, like the Crusades invented wars of religion. It was exclusively about religion, so to say. Religion is not even the best term, telling the truth, because it's a pejorative in the traditional view. But the point being, as we've seen also in the videos about the patricians, the plebeians, that there was a staunch divide between the estate that ruled in virtue of its primordial connection, its metaphysical connection with ancestors that had made it into the heavens, different degrees, and those, like the plebeians, that did not have that, right? That by definition, for example, worshipped chthonic deities that belonged to the netherworld, the chthonic dimension, therefore could not simply elevate themselves to heaven to begin with. Again, in theory, like this division was inherent. If you look at the same myth of the Rex Nemorensis and so on, could be somehow surpassed because everyone, even the slave, could in theory rise to the higher power. But of course, in more historical times, this was substantiated by, as we were saying before, like the dreadful presence of the fourth estate in general, that is like mostly like a dead weight in the history of civilization. It actually needed, because the higher estates rightfully exploit the raw energy from that, and everything is needed. Everything must be transcended, divine. Otherwise, it's not complete. It's not divine, really. But this disdain for work stemmed from the belief that physical toil bound individuals to necessity and the body, right? So they preoccupied themselves merely with menial issues. They were not, in origin, in an originally spiritual sense, to augment themselves by continuous regeneration, sort of eternal rejuvenation, rebooting of the divine cycle. And therefore, the sort of this more material side of the story mostly is exactly what the lower being concerns himself only with. Hence, I don't know why Marxism is materialistic. It's the same identical reason, philosophically speaking. It's not even concealed. It's literally expressed in Marxism. It's just for telling you how much of the same identical beliefs of the past, because they are the only ones. They're the only universal compass existing. You wonder why we talk about metaphysics, live on well to this day, right? And so the physical toil prevented the leisure, the schole in Hellenic, essential for intellectual and civic life, which also entailed naturally this right mix of contemplation and action, right? Because, of course, the Greeks were not simply some effeminate eunuchs. They did fight, they did conquer, and they truly also, through this philosophical sort of training, they motivated their politology, their right to conquest, etc. And this view was reinforced by the widespread use of slaves. In fact, in all the world, telling the truth at the time, and that you could see even in the most quote-unquote democratic classical Athens and other polis that weren't democratic at all, right? The demos never had any actual power because it never had the decisive moral majority in any of these systems. If anything, what that meant is that the demos could vote, but at the end of the day, they were still clienterly, in the sense also metaphysically, dependent on the higher estates. They always ruled, and that also in later Hellenic history took over further, compared to also the era which more or less was an peasant citizenry at the same time. They still made use of slaves on a regular basis. Now, slaves themselves possessed no loftier calling of dharma beyond endless toil. Besides, Hellenic society did not disdain slaves merely because they performed work. Rather, it first rejected labor as servile in essence. So it was still their own responsibility. As we've seen, in theory, they could have, again, been freemen. Instead, they had fallen to a level of subordination that was expressing their metaphysical inferiority, and therefore regarded anyone chained to this same slavery as naturally subordinate. This attitude prompted the deliberate maintenance of institutionalization of slavery, establishing a strict social divide for all whose lives could express themselves solely through physical exertion. All right, because in theory, even the poorest of the citizens was meant, given that the citizenry corresponded not to an abstract ideal, but to literally, I don't know, being an Athenian, being a Spartan, being a Roman, as being one of the most advanced peoples out there and lording over others, as a matter of fact. I will not digress on the demos or the plebeians further, but even there, the ambiguity of who was who with a slave, it does exist. Essentially, the slave is at some point society drew a boundary saying, like, people who can't, right, they just can't, right, they are under, which I think in general, considering like the collapse of IQ and sort of civic capacity, responsibility, whatever, should be reapplied in terms of this of limitation of voting rights to large swathes of the population. This happens, by the way, in every time of civilizational crisis. It's not really something that you can't debate. In other historical periods was described in different ways, but these ups and downs and the weakness of the fourth estate, it has always been there for that matter. It's not a matter of imposition. It's literally like you can't, like this relation of force favors, by the way, always fewer at the top, right? So nobody explains or knows how few at the top could control more at the bottom if there isn't an inherent superiority of the former. But aside from the fact, the importance of this is that, in theory, even the last of the citizens could and would have slaves, right, of some sort, servants working for them, etc. And slavery here is not to be understood in the industrialistic way we see also in contemporary history, that still actually express the subordination for sort of unequivocal reasons, but were driven historically by different ideological mechanisms. The sort of ancient slavery and slavery throughout to different periods was mostly an idea of clientelage in turn, of dependency, of gradation of this power, ratios. We've seen it also during the Middle Ages. There were some serfs, so non-freemen, and so again, whichever gradation you want to call slaves or serfs, whatever, it depends, really. But that were at some point, because they had abdicated their own freedom, sometimes willingly, not because they would have been challenging their nominal freedom, but because the fact that they were already that poor and weak on their own, to more powerful people that eventually would turn them into more powerful people than even freemen, nominally. We've seen this with the ministeriales, for example, in medieval Germany. It's partly true for the Mamluks, and again, every society had this thing, like also in more, even up to contemporary times, we talk the serf, like the housemaid or whatever, it's actually a different gradation of the same identical concept, and it consisted of an actual sort of hierarchy that in a sense reflected an actual divide between people. Right, that corresponded to an idea of society, of culture. There was an acceptation of the socio-cultural order, regardless of the fact that the struggle was always there and had to be there, because according to tradition, if you don't have such a thing, for example, like in Rome, the radical and bloody struggle at some point between the patricians and the plebeians, you can never really had Rome. Right? It's not a people completely subservient to another, like in totalitarian regimes that is stronger. Those regimes collapse, they're weak, all right? Just an exhausted people, a lesser people obeys to totalitarian regimes, to radical ideologies, because it is not able to express in any meaningful quantity, it doesn't matter how many millions live under it, any absolute moral force, and so very few people can lord over these people. Right, that's obvious. Like why, I don't know, the Soviet Union or Maoist China existed. Right, there is no other explanation. It's not a deep, I don't know, as Marxists would like to explain. No, it's actually the exploitation, or they weren't active. No, those were because those people sucked. right? There is no other historical reason for that. And we've seen the results, of course. Now, Aristotle, the influential Hellenic philosopher living between 384 322, with a disgusting introduction for Aristotle, like influential Hellenic philosopher, who systematized much of earlier thought, by the way, because as we just explained, it's not like Aristotle and Plato, where some people simply woke up in the morning and said, okay, well, I want to create a new philosophical system. They were all pondering. Like if you have any elementary philosophical education, you know that they were all rooted to those same higher principles in their previous religion. This is admittedly even from a place where I come from, we teach history of philosophy also in schools and so on, is hardly ever respected. Also, I suspect in higher education, I took some philosophy classes, but say it wasn't, at least in my case, because I was a historian, like a basic history of philosophy. It was already some sort of specific sort of select topics. But again, I studied 3 years of philosophy in school, like a lot, like in high school. And it was actually very good. But nowhere this concept is to be presented. They, in this disgustingly modernistic and structuralistic sense, they tell you, okay, there is Thales of Miletus, and this is what he believed, and this other guy believed, and they present you these all different boxes that have almost nothing to do with one another, if not in debunking each other along the way, as if this was a competition for who was sort of the most intelligent, smarter guy. And they don't tell you that there was a Catholically ecumenic picture about this that was unfolding from the myth, right, the age of the gods. This is what the entirety of Aristotle, Plato, and all their also further schools, right, that really emanated even well after their death to influence, to inform our the entire Western thought were about. Right, and we're very much the children of the Hellenes as far as this is concerned, because truly from an intellectual point of view, this is what the West has become. And again, the aforementioned scientism or materialism to a degree has to do with this. Often technologism, determined, this is a bit of a sclerotic thinking, right? Had we been trained on Roman thought and ascetics and moral, we would probably have a much more different mentality. In a sense, fortunately, we have, because we managed to salvage that. Well, Aristotle provided a theoretical defense of the same slavery system in his Politics, in his Politeia, beginning at Book 1, Chapter 4, asserting that some humans are by nature fitted only for bodily tasks and thus require direction and governance from those suited to nobler activities. Right? It's just, imagine, again, I don't know, like in a solution, there is the more dense stuff that gets at the bottom, just out of the gravitational attraction, of course, and the more rarefied one at the top, right? Just like in the atmosphere, it's all like this. So spiritually, this was believed to be the same identical concept. It's just like, I don't know, like the concept of Uranian rule of the Indo-European conquerors over the Pelasgians in their Chthonic cults. Right, it's the same identical thing. They were always entwined, were never separated. Fully, you find elements of both. There was never like a moment in which, I don't know, even the Indo-Europeans in the steppes did not have a darker chthonic figure in their mythology or whatever. But here we're talking about probably a historical phenomenon that occurred between two civilizations that, you remember before what I said, that increase actually magnitudinally their potential so the more conflictual they actually are, right? This is the point. The stronger the force, the more you can wield it, right? If you succeed in taming these forces. Aristotle defined natural slaves as those lacking full deliberate reason, perceiving it but not possessing it, making them as different from free men as body from soul or beast from human. Consider the Romans that called the slaves instrumenta vocali as opposed to the semi-vocali that were the animals. So basically the slaves spoke and the animals half spoke. Basically, slaves by connection were half animals themselves. But back to Aristotle, with slavery beneficial when the master supplies the rational guidance they inherently lack. And this is intended, of course, Aristotelian speaking, as a very positive thing. Right? So now in this framework, the Hellene stood as the antithesis of the barbarian in the same way, right? They truly, in that sense, the Greeks truly thought to be the chosen people, just like the Romans did, other peoples did, and that the less developed savages out there were the barbarians, right? It's also difficult to unsee this in a perspective of conquest, because indeed, why do the Hellenes and the Romans develop the more Olympianly Apollonian of theologies? Because these were the Indo-European peoples that had conquered by far the best parts of Europe, and in fact, as a consequence, had disproportionately the greater power in Europe. Other peoples were fractally dispersed, right, incapable of coalescing, and ending up conquered and dominated by them, right, in Europe, in Asia, etc. Again, it's difficult to unsee this, right? I understand that we're born in the West in the 20th and the 21st century, and so we have been specifically trained to see slavery, to a degree, absolutely, as something that can cripple and limit that same human potential, especially in the contemporary makings of it, in the contemporary styles of it, where the same tradition had been largely forgotten. But this is an incredibly narrow and exclusive worldview. Like, most people in the world actually think, I don't know, people like the Russians live like 6% in conditions of slavery right now. So it's not distant. We can all almost see that in different echelons of society, of economics, in a ever more interconnected world. And this was for most of history, like essentially all of history, the mainstay, the main view. And obviously, since we're doing, again, comparing the Indo-Europeistics, a strikingly analogous structure exists notoriously in early Vedic. I always say Vedic because the Vedas at some point ended, at least as we understand it, as a civilization, but ideally they continued as the Hindu one. In their society, the Shudra caste, originally composed of subjugated indigenous populations, frequently characterized as also darker-skinned, quote-unquote, enemy races. You can see this in all Indian art prominently, like there's the radical macroscopical overrepresentation of the white hero versus the black evil guy. And this because even in a people that largely was, again, India is enormous, and you can't say ethnically sort of generalizing is inconsistent as such, but indeed, like this view that the Vedic mold, that the sacred texts of Hinduism stem from this broader conquest by Central, at that point, Indo-European invaders, with the conquered peoples relegated exclusively to serving the quote-unquote twice-born upper castes with no access to any superior vocation. As far as the twice-born you are, those are the people, as we were saying before, that earn a shot in heaven because they are essentially born twice, winning over the second death, right? That is essentially the divine judgment. So the soul, the second soul of the individual, after the death of the one and the return of the third to the netherworld, manages to truly live in the dies natalis, just like in ancient Christianity. Like the day of your birth is the day of your accession to heaven, as a matter of fact. And so that is the most glorious moment, if of course you manage to surpass judgment. That is understood also to exist in the end time, but it shouldn't be understood in a consequential sense, because the traditional idea of time is a very different one. But the twice-born, thus, was the one who achieved heaven, and as such continued to, by the way, interact from there with his clan, with conferring further power, helping to achieve heaven also for their own successors. The Mors Triumphalis, in this sense, is probably the beginning of life, right? Death is only the beginning, so to say. And the lower elements didn't have that. I mean, this was just like the plebeians in Rome. It's true, again, that, I don't know, in that case, I don't know, even the Roman plebeians were endowed with more liberty than, I don't know, an average Indian peasant, as a matter of fact. However, the divide was truly understood to be the same. And to each its own, in the sense that all these peoples, just like in ancient Rome, we find that the plebeian deities are, I don't know, chaos. They are the sort of mostly the Platonic ones, the one associated with agriculture, the feminine cults, everything that had been conquered from the pre-Indo-European times, and substantiating itself in literally like also anthropological form, right? Specific behavior, level of intelligence, etc. Now, this worldview also shaped conceptions of legitimate authority and royal dignity in the same way. We also made lots of videos about sacred royalty for that matter. Aristotle pointed out that kings gained their elevated standing in part by acting as overseers and priests of the community's sacred rituals. The Politeia, book 5, second. Compare also with the third book 9 as well. We surely make more in-depth videos on the very texts. The concept here is the same we've seen in any other traditional society, right? The rulers, the kings, the sacred kings in this sense were also just like the Pontifex Maximus, at least as a faculty of the Rex. The Roman Rex eventually was distributed in the Roman oligarchy. Was truly the prerogative of the medium with God, just like Augustus speaks of his deeds in the Res Gestae, right? Through his own auspices, the imperium was restored. Also through the second birth of Julius Caesar as a divus, or as a comment, really. Now, when beginning his investigations into living beings, Aristotle invoked Heraclitus's famous remark that says something like, "Enter, for here too dwell gods," right? Heraclitus, as you know, is a pre-Socratic philosopher who lived around 535 or 475 BC, known for his cryptic sayings on flux and unity. Aristotle recounts visitors finding Heraclitus warming himself by the kitchen stove and hesitating, to which he invited them in, affirming divine presence even in mundane places, thus emphasizing sacredness permeating all nature, right? Even sacred fire had something to do with that. It's also an echo of it. And surely, speaking of the doctrine of the two natures, the impact of these ideas is definitely deep. Now, we are just browsing this period in classical philosophy by anecdotes, but Goethe later captured, if you want, parallel intuition when he said that beauty, which is definitely a moral value in tradition, is a original phenomenon. It's something that derives from a higher dimension, right? And as you know, Plato also believed in his aesthetics. We'll see now pretty similar things, as a matter of fact. And so there is a hyper-real archetype that dominates the world, because the world is just an hologram of the same. For the Hellenes, rational scrutiny of nature derived its worth not from isolated utility, as it would mostly approximate it to now, but from its capacity to point toward a superior cosmic balance. Again, I can't stress enough how this lens on Hellenic philosophy is underrated and probably even not truly understood, not known, not widespread at least. Even some of the most, again, Platonically, Pelagianly influenced philosophers were carrying in Nietzsche some kind of idea of the higher nature, right? We've seen it also in alchemy with some certain Gnostic or Protestant authors that are saying sort of pretty blatantly wrong things, but at the end of the day, they're still adhering to the extent of which, like unbeknownst to them, because of the aforementioned mistakes, to a higher Catholic principle. Hellenic rationality thus remained inseparable from a deep faith in myth, which functioned as the original and archetypal voice of elevated reason. The Hellenic world, its philosophy, etc., were not if not sort of relatively, the process of a modernization, or a push modernization, secularization. They were not self-standing philosophies. It all was religiously based, was theologically based. Their entire language, if you have any idea of ancient Greek, and again, it's Indo-European meaning, etymologies, is heavily all about this. It's as if, like, when they had spoken that language, they knew, of course, far better than us, this was a sacred language modeled on, as we've seen in the Indo-European theology series, on exclusively on a cosmic basis, on a cosmic reflection description. All right. If you study, again, Hellenic philosophy, presuming that these are standalone beliefs that self-nourish themselves from strange logical propositions, paradoxes, puzzles, and so on, you haven't understood the deeper spirit of this. Also, for example, saying Socrates, the first sophistics, regardless, again, of the fact that mostly we get that from through Plato, but the original meaning, any kind of provocation, the concept of the daimon, for example, etc., are as familiar to us, even in just the transliteration in our respective languages from the original mode that is common to the European ones anyway, entirely theological in nature. These were not created out of scratch. They always had a basis. They had foundational words. Think about things like the nous or the udar. I am preparing, depending on the philosopher, of course, could have different ideas on this, but all of them were just facets of a pretty easy, sort of not easily, at least I do it on a regular basis, but factually reconstructible universal theology that lived in the very foundation of the languages that not just they spoke at the time, but we still speak today. Again, I made at this point tens of hours of comparing Indo-European texts as a proper linguistic content to show you how coherent and in itself concluded the entire Indo-European language was, right, and all its ramifications following. Hellenic culture has thus continued to serve as a foundational paradigm in and of itself, especially from a philosophical, scientific point of view, for European civilization, right? Comparable to the lasting resonance of the Olympic ideal among elite Europeans, right? Aristocratic Europeans, educated Europeans, if you want. You can check out the video I made about the Olympians, for that matter, so where the primordial root lays. However, one also must avoid misinterpreting this legacy by confining it to a superficial, secularized version of quote-unquote scientific method, which would entirely miss its profound spiritual, metaphysical, and traditional significance. Plato, the Athenian philosopher, 428 circa at least 348 BC, and founder of the Academy, whose dialogues profoundly shaped Western thought, more than any other thinker uncovers the authentic core of Hellenic intellectual quote-unquote science. That, by the way, is a Latin word. Of course, they used different terms. Greek was truly more secularized and less semantically shaded than Latin. Some of you will say, well, Greek can have, 20 minutes in a same word. Yeah, but what equivalent is of science? There is episteme, that is more like the scientific theoretical knowledge of necessary universal truths. That is mostly intended in philosophical language as what and how can we know something about it. As you understand how we sort of even dumb down its greater depth, there's technique, which is the craft, art, skill, practical production, phronesis, practical wisdom for ethical action, sophia, indeed, philosophical wisdom, perhaps the thing that comes closest, combining episteme and nous, or intuitive intellect. In any case, this is also like, it never really made history of philosophy videos, but say I really have more than one horse in the race, or at least I used to. and it would be very interesting at some point to expand on that. In any case, Plato drew a sharp distinction between the imperfect, mutable systems of the perceptible world, mere things. This is very notorious, like the concept of ideas of the Imperium. In fact, the eternal and changing archetypes of the intelligible sphere, the ideas always evaluating sensory experience by the measure of timeless truth, right? So the world is an hypostasis of a much superior principle. And everybody studied this, like the allegory of the cave in the Republic, very Latin sound, though it wasn't, as you know, called like that in Greek. Book 7, 514, 17, if I'm not wrong, vividly illustrating the trajectory of genuine cognition, escaping the deceptive shadows projected by artificial fire to encounter the authentic radiance of real sunlight. And so the idea of the scam, of the fact that we are slaves to something, in any case, it can be also our own ego. We've seen this recently in alchemy, referring to the quintessence and sort of the purification of the same soul. And so giving a pretty sort of good, solid visual metaphor of how we're looking at something that literally has no value, right? And we're stuck to it in the darkness, whereas the true enlightenment is outside. And there are all these kind of metaphors in all Indo-European religions and beyond, for that matter. The concept of being provided, by the way, the essential foundation for all Hellenic philosophical inquiry, preventing it from lapsing into empty intellectual exercise, right? There could have not been an intellectual exercise hadn't there been such a thing. It's a bit like in math and geometry, like the concept of a surface, of a plane, of a point, of a line. They're foundational exactly because we can't possibly, it's just like believing in those, it's like believing in God, right? There is no actual humanly achievable evidence than divinely transfiguring. And that's also why we're stuck into scientism as opposed to sort of browse a bit better the actual meaning of tradition in ancient religions. Now, Plato stressed that authentic philosophy, so true wisdom, as we've seen, consists in grasping, quote, in a very sort of personal translation, what truly is, right? It renders the idea. And so something that is hyper-real, that truly exists because it is the being. It's there. It doesn't move. It's unmovable, right? Even Aristotle has basically the same concept, with the unmoved mover also, eventually collected by scholastics in the Middle Ages with embracing of his thoughts. And this is contrasted with the illusory appearances. This is still a Republic 5:19 instead, that are, as we were saying before, just the hologramic reality in which we live, right? We are the illusory appearances, or it's not merely a sensorial thing. It's not merely a metaphor. It's literally a metaphysical condition, right? Remember that if you've studied at school, at university. So those possessing, of course, such insight, so the oi sophoi, so that those who could truly discriminate between being and becoming, deserve, at least by degree, because, achieving the being would simply, okay, you solve the problem. You don't have to think about it for now, through that achievement from the human to the divine, deserved the paramount rank within any legitimate political system as well, right? This is expressed in Republic 5:18, 6:1, 6:15. So those who rule, as we said at the top, it's because they have elevated themselves from a spiritual point of view and actually wield power, right? The Romans would have doubled down on this had they had the same level of philosophical interest and development, because that power simply manifests, right? We often read Plato's Republic as just as a prescriptive thing, but it's actually descriptive of reality. Right, it's not a merely a rhetorical exercise, right? It points out very important questions that are truly lighted up in the moment in which realize their metaphysical meaning. It's like saying, who will judge the judges, right? These philosophers at the head of the state. It's not a matter of, who check. Yeah, it is also referring to a secular reality, to actual people. But the point is, in that sense, more deeply or more highly, if you prefer, who does control he who has to gap, like the pontifex in Rome, the distance between man and God. Because it's the path, the direction, that way is entirely in his own hand, if nobody can even, in fact, be surpassing. So it's not a criticism, a populistic idiocy like today, like, I don't know, there are these guys at the top, who controls them, they're shady deal, they're corrupted. It is true, as everybody is corrupt, but the most important point of that is that others can't be there because they are not able to, right? And this is really offering a refined and intensified expression of traditional ideas. I was thinking about so many different things at a time in any case. Armed with immediate knowledge of ultimate normative reality, these individuals were uniquely qualified to enact laws rooted in real justice, as Republic 6:1 says. This reasoning culminated in Plato's well-known pronouncement that states and humanity itself will find no relief from their miseries until philosophers become rulers, or rulers generally acquire philosophical wisdom. Philosophical wisdom that, again, is to be understood, this is what I wanted to say, in that higher concept of rule, of actual rule, not a philosopher, as today you think a philosopher, or like a weak old man that just knows a lot of things and maybe it's sort of all wrong and rigged, and this guy is also maybe a shady guy. This is what philosophers are actually today. In Plato's meaning, that has no less to do with the idea that you have to officiate a sacred priestly performance, just like as also in Aristotle and as the Romans themselves would, because they share this level of imperium and divine connection, as they distributed the original royal and therefore unitary function across a broader audience. Also, the Greeks, they naturally did not have kings, at least in this later phase, and actually, as you know, Plato was very aristocratically minded for his times, obviously, and always, and without any interruption whatsoever, including the so-called, Periclean, quote-unquote, democracy. That was never, again, a democracy. Direct democracy does not exist. Never existed, thank God. People have absolutely no clue what to do. Most of the times just must be commanded. They let themselves being commanded. But the Greeks themselves believed that their establishment, in fact, was endowed with that kind of essentially aristocratic power, regardless of how we have wanted to, again, oppose a hyper aristocratic model, say, of the Bronze Age compared to the Polis later on. But they still heavily believed in a radically aristocratic, God-given right to rule over our people. All right? Just think about the Sophia in that sense of the highest wisdom that is expressed by Athena, the goddess of war. Right? That is an imperial prerogative, essentially. Remember discipline, what we said before, discipline does not exist if there is not much of a leader. Again, this is what a Roman would have mostly said. Again, in Thucydides, as we said before, would have been a discipline ideally at least dictated by some level of citizenry compactness, not necessarily equality. It could correspond, it should correspond ideally also, like in the Roman fasces, to some level of, again, equality, or some level of, again, sort of gold standard distribution of power among people, because otherwise, as we've seen, you fall below and there are the slaves, those who actually are not free, cannot wield arms, they do not have power on their own because they do not have the wisdom to do so. And the imbued virtues infused by Mars during that is the second element of the Trinity, by the way, that in Rome is something very different from Ares, that gets in fact, the Hellenic world constantly crushed, always crushed, as a matter of fact, by Athena, and is hated by his own parents, namely Zeus and Hera, both of them representing the sort of the Uranian, the Chthonic, the transfigurately Chthonic dimension. Because Ares is a fuck up, right? That's the model that does not work unless, because it's already the degenerate warrioristic ethos, right? The same one that brings Achilles to hell, right? A Roman already would have literally thought that his imperatores achieved divinity. And if you have an idea of how the funerary rite of the Cursio was performed, you perfectly have an idea of how step-like the thing was, with the eagle, with the horses, and sacred fire in particular. Now, this and this I also made, if you're interested, by the way, very briefly, the video about the gladiators, right? The traditional meaning of the munera that explains how truly the Romans thought in those funerary games that the imperium of the dead that had achieved, in fact, as we've seen, the second victory over the second death, and so basically second life, had been twice born, could save these other gladiators that as slaves, accepted death, however, so in a stoic way that would make them achieve that level of freedom and therefore of heaven in death in the trail of that leader. This is beautiful, and nobody has ever told you this about gladiators because, who does study these things to begin with? And they're fairly even easy to realize if you have sort of some basic understanding of Roman religion and how the munera were performed and why. Now, this, but going back to the idea of the philosophers and the absolute wisdom, in the fact that, as we've seen, rulers would have to generally acquire this philosophical wisdom until political power and wisdom unite in the same persons. This is the same concept of the Roman Imperium, telling the truth, but you see how in a much more adulterated way compared to the primordial and much more frightening concept it really was, and with the separate embodiments of each otherwise kept apart by necessity. This is Republic 5:18. Plato supported his views with examples from other cultures as well, noting that in Egypt a king could not legitimately reign without priestly qualities. And foreign usurper had to undergo subsequent initiation to the priestly order, absolutely, as expressed in the Republic, and shows how it was, in fact, not even just an Indo-European thing, that there would be an incredibly interesting video to make about probably the Western origin, according to Egyptian mythology, explicitly Western origin. Western intended, naturally, it's symbolical, but also not symbolical, not in the sense of Westerners as we understand the concept of Westerners today, but still connected with that, as probably the race of kings, as a matter of fact. So the whole story of Atlantis and so on. Now, Platonic myths frequently employ striking symbolic language. As you know, they're very beautiful. Plato was definitely more ascetical, more mystical, more figurative, more truly moral, as opposed to Aristotle, more scientific in a sense. But they all stem again from the same mold, right? The soul's higher destiny in Plato depends on the charioteer's control over the noble white horse in opposition to the chaotic black one, is famously in Phaedrus. Phaeton's catastrophic attempt to drive Helios's chariot arises from his inability to restrain his horses. Right? There is a balance, in other words, between the Uranian, the chthonic dimension, if you're not used to that, and only Helios, that is the Apollo, as he who possesses this wisdom to rule the world and to literally, in fact, maneuver the chariot of the sun itself can handle. All right. And as you know, in Hellenic mythology, there's plenty of such catastrophic myths. Think about Prometheus, think about Icarus, right? All these figures that have too much hubris and sort of human frailty and interest, so to say, to truly achieve divinity. And you see in these myths that they almost make it, as a matter of fact. But again, they get crushed and died and whatever. And again, there are different myths telling the truth. Prometheus at some point has also some help in Hercules, by the way. That's not random. It's a very beautiful concept also of the price that civilization has to pay for its power. All right, that, however, can definitely have a positive income. Whereas Icarus is mostly like if you indulge just in technologism without thinking higher, so you can achieve things, but you will always fail in any case because you can't contemplate the entirety of the world in a merely material sense. That's the meaning behind it. Now, the horse, linked traditionally to Poseidon, to the deity of mutable fluid forces, that has, as you know, a deeply powerful chthonic, the most chthonic of all in Hellenic mythology, and in the sense very strong Pelagian connections. In fact, he's the brother of Zeus. Like the Romans would have never had such a thing for Jupiter. That was probably an absolute numinous, the absolute totalizing power in absolute terms. Stands for the untamed vital energies of existence. So the origin is important, rather how eventually different peoples had began to degrade and to forget this or that idea. And Hellenic mythology is actually probably the most evocative, the most beautiful, the one that echoes the most, because again, the Dorians were initially the most successful in the European conquerors. And yes, there was a Dorian migration. I made an entire video explaining what we mean by that. And yes, it did happen. And you find all kind of parallelisms, by the way. For example, even in Confucian doctrine, from the Zongyong to the Doctrine of the Mean, one of the 4 books of Confucianism, traditionally attributed to Zizi, Confucius' grandson, emphasizing balance, just like the chariot there, sincerity. The Persians were told that they were trained properly to tell always the truth, the nobility, otherwise the winged glory would fly away from them and their royal power, in harmony with heaven's mandate. Right? You had properly to enter that cosmic harmony, syntony, in a space between men and gods, as the myths really say, to wield that power in an eternal strife, right, balancing contemplation and action, etc. And Confucianism, in this sense, insists that no ethical rule holds validity unless it accords with one's intrinsic nature. That's also very interesting. It basically means that the way you're instantiated in the world has fallen a path of the fall that, in this sense, does not necessarily have to be properly bridged identically back in a mere reversal, but however conditions you, like it's both an advantage, a blessing, and a curse. Right, the way you wield your power can be good, can be evil, can be right, can be wrong, and it's on you. It's your characteristics. It's how you are that really will give the measure of whether you achieve divinity or not, and by which degree mostly. Because again, there is a divide between those who make it into heaven that is not entirely divinizing. All right, it's just a different degree. But there we have to open the parenthesis about the end time, etc. I will not do this. Now, Plato defines justice himself through alignment with natural roles. In cases where hierarchy did not arise spontaneously from self-knowledge and natural fidelity, the obedience of the lower to the higher transcended simple submission. It transformed into a reverential, quasi-ritual offering of devotion and self-yielding to a superior principle, and exalted self the subordinate could not innately realize as personal svadharma, like it's a concept of Vedic theology, but which he could make the center of his existence through dedicated, pious service of the elevated order. And this is expressed with striking similarity by Plato. I would like to stress that, again, if you look even at medieval history and societal connections, think about the Arma Sacrata or the Vassus Senior connection, the Commendatio, etc., you have a pretty clear and explicit sort of documentation, historical evidence of how these connections societally worked, right? Becoming somebody's client in ancient Rome entailed a specific rite of passage, right? This is true when you enter the ancient war bands, the sacred brotherhood of warriors. You had always to enter a new dimension, right? At this higher sort of organic, hierarchical, mystical body of, say, the res publica or the polis, etc., really entails in a bigger universal picture. And so also the higher the purpose, the higher the level of such elevation, meaning that a Roman plebeian could be a free citizen in arms, receiving land in conquered provinces with slaves and having this higher status of a master race over that conquered peoples, even though in Rome he was just nobody, right? But he still, of course, the protection of the Roman citizens and by Roman legal system was commensurate with that, but still this hierarchy followed also within a broader hierarchy of peoples, for example. But back to Plato, that says these things all basically in the Republic. He explains that the ordinary person is best governed internally by the same divine principle that rules the best individuals, right? In other words, the imperium does manifest through the control of authority in a higher metaphysical sense. We sort of obey our government if we're not governing ourselves, because this, again, has a power like a magnet to align ourselves as long as it is powerful enough. And we can't govern ourselves by ourselves because there's something bigger that does, right? And if not present within, external rule by the wise is definitely preferable and beneficial, not harmful. And that's how they essentially justified slavery on the same basis. Now, Plato associates Olympic victory directly with the city's preservation. For example, the success of victors brings salvation to the entire community. The seized warriors could also ascend to Hesiod's eternal golden race, which persists unseen as protective guardians. And these are, by the way, we get some information about different authors in Plato. It's obvious for Socrates, but also Hesiod in this case through other, in fact, authors. And Hesiod, by the way, we often mention him because he was a heavily Pelagian author, but still he expressed in this sort of still sensualistic abandonment certain principles that were part of this higher realization of the divine origin, of this divine root, right? So absolutely that there is, as expressed in this citation, an idea that, again, our ancestors in heaven, those who have achieved heaven, protect everybody, including those who haven't gone to heaven and that await for the ultimate judgment in the struggle in the end time. And in this sense, they are the true power. And so in this sense, God is the true ruler in any case. Right? This was evident in Plato, in Hesiod. That's the most obvious theological consequence of such idea. The Atlantis story, that, again, is way more fascinating than all this mentally feeble people that try to dispatch it for, there's the new continent, we haven't dug archaeological. I mean, it could even be, let's say, without any, that those were just hippies that, think that tradition is communism or something like that. Smoking pot or whatever. And the Atlantis story is quite instructive as it depicts, of course, from Plato in this case, because there are other references to a Western, again, island. Atlantis does not just stop to Plato, as some people actually believe, but it depicts its original inhabitants, descendants, and students of the divine, right? The Ars Regia, if you want, that the Romans, for example, still spoke of explicitly in these terms. The Greeks had already sort of softened the language, as gradually losing their sacred quality, in fact, through repeated intermingling with mortals. Because this was the golden race of the gods that copulated. This is to be found also in the Bible, like angels copulating with humans giving birth to giants. It's the same identical belief. And in this sense, that there is a degradation of the Atlantean race, permitting the human characteristics to dominate. This is notorious again in Critias. The participation of divine nature through the manifold and frequent mixture with mortals began to diminish the human nature, and the human nature prevailed, right? And naturally, their early achievements stemmed from the persistence of divine nature within them instead. Right, so this Atlantid race decided basically for moral reasons to undermine itself and to collapse. Gold obviously characterized the ruling element. This is to be found in Plato's Republic, echoing in heroic myths with ancient connotations. Plato connects cataclysmic myths like Phaetons to disruptions in the stellar path as well. This was the original meaning also of the fall, the incarnation of the celestial vault, a cosmic reordering triggered by sort of mutual, sort of terrestrial and partially at least celestial shifts, because as we explained, it's a God is truly in a higher dimension. We can't see the heavens, we can ascend to some of them, but the highest dimension, a truly unmovable one, a truly unaffected one, is way beyond. That is not altered, but it's our element that has created itself out of it. The androgen myth recounts an original mighty unified race whose power alarmed the gods, prompting division into male and female halves to diminish their threat. This is expressed in the Symposium. The myth of the androgens is quite interesting because, even though the name makes you think, oh no, this is sexually ambiguous. No, it's not sexually ambiguous. It's basically about actually very strongly obvious sort of sexual bond between man and woman, in as much as sort of the attraction is based on this capacity as a mystical body in one, like in holy matrimony, to in fact to sum the power of the two that are also heavily subordinated, right? Man, of course, in tradition is intended as superior, the woman as inferior, but they could never achieve that higher dimension weren't they united. And this is, in fact, also the most beautiful aspect of this traditional aspect, is that even the lowest element has a meaning, a purpose, and a function in the entire system, in the entire universe. So even slavery in that sense is not to be, as we were explaining before, understood as some sort, at least, again, humans make it fall in that direction, but as a degenerating, exterminating fashion, right? As an holocaustic one. That's a complete waste, right? The true hero, the true conqueror manages to transcend, right? And this is incredibly important. In Atlantis, Plato gave birth in pairs, mirroring motives such as even like the Aztec serpent woman, Quetzalcoatl, who generates numerous twins in water cycle traditions. At some point, I'll make a video about the Mexican tradition in that sense, because it's really like also connected with same Atlantean myth in ways that are sort of way underappreciated, but the same sort of primordial, archetypal, mythological motives are the same. We tend to divide everything, except from the fact that the world was always entwined. It's not like you have to wait the Vikings or Columbus to say, oh, there was an influence between the continents. There was always, right? It had always happened. That's how they got populated to begin with. But also their myths are quite eloquent, and there you can speak of a truly universal value. Plato traces Eros through greatest stages as well, ascending from ordinary physical desire, just like animals, towards the divine. In his Symposium, if you're interested here, the reference in 1415, 2629, Phaedrus 244-45, and 51 to 57, reaching its summit in the mortal impulse, quote, to live always, to be immortal. Because the love of God is the highest concept. This is from the Symposium 206. You see how also pretty mainstreamly, absolutely in line with Christianity this entire thing really is, and how people have absolutely no clue that Christianity stands not as a copy religion, but as the only religion that existed still today as Christianity, and in at least maintaining also, especially in Catholicism, the deepest connection with ancient tradition. But again, what I'm even talking about this, like if you want to hear this, I made so many videos about it that I don't need to repeat myself. If you don't, that's something you don't tell me that I didn't warn you about. Plato evokes a central cosmic locus beyond the Nordic Midgard, the divine Middle Earth, when describing, for example, Zeus's majestic council seat for deciding Atlantis' destiny. Because, of course, these guys have gone astray, and so Zeus's Holy Ghost cannot bless them. This is exactly an exalted midpoint, very much like the Nordic Midgard, that surveys everything involved in becoming, the subject to justice that is to be made also by mankind in its divine attempt. This is, if you read Critias, 121 AD, like, you find that. And this also aligned, by the way, with the triadic cosmic system encompassing heaven, earth, surface, and the underworld that is very much at the basis of the Trinitarian principles of Indo-European tradition and more. All right, the triadic structure is also one of our favorite topics in alchemy for that. But basically, all alchemy is about the Holy Trinity. That's literally it. I mean, the entire Indo-Europeans is about, entire tradition is about that. But again, people don't know that. But passing to Rome, this is also so obviously very important in comparison. Such you think we would get away without Rome? Definitely not. Such Indo-European patterns manifest vividly here in the urbs, where color symbolism, for example, for fundamental social roles corresponded to those in India and Iran. How? Well, the white for the flamines, the flamens, notably the flamen dialysis albogalus cap, red for military commanders, paludamentum, and royal robes, including Romulus's. And when you appreciate this, you can see how basically, as we will talk about the flamines, we should make a video entirely about that, but of course there is a priestly function that copes with divine fire, and this is partly shared by the same establishment, indeed, that given that the various magistrates, various senators had shared different offices at different time, and so basically was truly one. Like, you know, that in India, basically the priestly case came to rule over the warriors, whereas at least in the West it never fully succeeded, because in any case the investiture controversy still maintained an important degree of unity between the universal powers, and in Rome, of course, or also partially, at least in Byzantine Empire. I say partially because the church was always independent from the state at that point, otherwise it would have not been Christianity to begin with. So the warriors, the imperatores, as a matter of fact, to rule over the priesthood, or being priests de facto, pontifices maximi themselves. The Trinitarian deities, Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, that are, again, literally God, the Holy Ghost, and the Son. And I don't even need how to explain that. We talked about how Mars manifested in some videos, for example, about the Roman army religion as Mars Ultor. It was truly understood as an infusing grace of power. The Furor, you see how you can entwine this with the Virtus as well. While Quirinus was the prototype Roman, and Romulus himself. And also in this a mystical sort of mankind as well. Other peoples had the same kind. Thinking about Twisto and Manus from the Germans, etc. Even though, again, things get a bit lost into historiographical shades, and I'm not going to digress into that. But these, the Roman Trinity oversaw the three primary functions, mirroring the same area cases. Essentially, magical, juridical sovereignty, martial prowess, and fertility/prosperity. This was naturally very much studied by Georges Dumézil, the 20th century French comparative mythologist, 1898-1986, who developed the three-functional hypothesis of Proto-Indo-European society. And he, at some point, came at least to criticize his own theory because he made it too rigid. And it's not like, however, this does not exist either. So some people, like, there are very bad videos online that tries to suggest that there isn't such thing like a tripartite society historically, that Dumézil himself, to an extent, was not embracing at the fullest, like, the range of compared Indo-Europeans. Mostly he was a mythologist. So naturally, he was a man of overwhelming culture, education. Unfortunately, he was also a bit sidelined because of his sort of older beliefs and sort of political past, but say his studies are absolutely a necessary starting point. But if you actually extend Indo-Europeans, if you have time to, not to just mythology, but obviously a broader array of ideas. Personally, through the Indo-European theological series, I think that the true functional hypothesis should be not doubled, but exponentially down, but by all means available, meaning that the differences the different peoples may have between one another and even within themselves with the original tripartite function is always stemming from a degenerative process. That is not to say mix in the card and say something that is based on a quinto functional hypothesis. There isn't such a thing, first of all, right? There isn't a dyadic hypothesis. There is always repeated the same trifunctional one. Just if there are other gods that have other functions that are considered as offshoots, as hypotheses, as branches, and the foundational principle, the same etymologies of the same Indo-European vocabulary stress unitarily this trifunctional mechanism. There's also kind of obvious. I mean, the Holy Trinity in Christianity is literally the same identical thing. It explains metaphysically, theologically, religiously, if you want, the same identical concept, same identical mechanism that returns over and over again, all these myths, right? So people sort of forced to match certain interpretations that were categorical because Tolkien in the 20th century and as such said, oh no, everything is invalidated there. No, because you stopped to what Dumézil said and did, but first of all, you don't even know what he actually did with his work, and in any case, you don't go beyond that. You just want to use, if you have especially ideological reasons, to say, oh well, Dumézil came himself to criticize some of his own assumptions about the trifunctional hypothesis, so everything is wrong, this is BS, but you will say he's just a great scholar, mythologist, so it's interesting, but you don't get that beyond that itself because you haven't been there, obviously. And you know what we're talking about again, like priests, sovereigns, warriors, producers, that can easily overlap, for example. This is easily displayed in medieval history. I remember at university you have these professors that are actually cultured in their hyper-specialized field, but say they heard somewhere like, there isn't actually, just think about the idiocy of this. This is the top QRS humanistic faculty in the world, by the way. When I concluded my PhD, and the statement was, but the tripartite functionality does not work because, I mean, look at the Middle Ages. There were actual, warriors that were also monks, right? And they were so. Let me understand. So the tripartite functionality did not exist because you could be both things at the same time. So I don't know. The tripartite functionality explains a metaphysical dynamic. It has nothing to do with how it categorizes, I don't know, as a Marxist class that has no connection with reality itself. Obviously, the systems overlapped. Obviously, they did because they actually overlap entirely in God. And that's why there is a dynamic such as like the one of the Holy Ghost that permeates the Son, the achieving Son into coming closer to divine, to augment himself. It's a dynamic. All right, and I don't know if you have any idea of the same Roman religious system, you know that, as we said before, so the same Rex ideally had everything in his own hands, that this was gradually fractioned, partitioned, distributed among more people at a time. It doesn't mean that the mechanism, the Trinitarian mechanism, is not there. Hell, even von Clausewitz has that. As a matter of fact, if you don't study history of warfare, if you don't study history of religions, you shouldn't pretend that you know any of it, right? Especially these principles, like you haven't studied in, for example, observing the pantheons across Indo-European cultures. If you have the specifically structuralistic view that try to tell you these are all different systems and that every god is separated from another, has almost like a workers, a foretestators functioning to that craft or another, and that didn't tell you how they are all metaphysically part of the same being, right? This is really easy to get. And by the way, there are beautiful works. I mean, the same Dumézil does not actually invalidate the entire, or even the foundations of the same tripartite functionality. If you look at his work, Jupiter Marx Quirinus, regardless also of what could be said later, it doesn't matter, right? It dates to, for example, 1941, quite a year, I would say. And there are also later editions, naturally, but this applies to, at least to Roman evidence, and identifies, this was the primordial, by the way, Trinity, because Rome had eventually later, like Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, but this was originally the most veracious one, identifying, obviously, this is Pacific, really. Jupiter as sovereignty, Mars as martial force, but understood, again, in a quite infused sense, right, as a spirit, right, as a soma, as a matter of fact. And this had to do, in fact, with the same rites of, initiation and, again, sacred brotherhood that dedicated to Mars. Look at the Lapis Satricanum, this Sodalis Mamertae, if you're interested. We shall make some videos about that. And Quirinus as a communal prosperity, but even there, like, it's not really, like, only about that. Quirinus is the sun in that sense. It's the incarnated man in the lower nature. Mars is truly the Holy Ghost, and Jupiter is the higher nature, the divine one, the immutable one. For this reason, Jupiter embodied, for example, the detached absolute sovereignty personified in Alba Longa and Rome's kings. By the way, Alba Longa meaning high and white, which is exactly the sacred citadel of the Asgard, and the, as we said before, also connected properly with the sacred, the sanctuary, like of all Latins, like in the ancient Latium Vetus. Eventually, the Roman kings themselves were more powerful than that symbol. And Jupiter is symbolized, obviously, by the trophies of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, including Thunderbolt, Eagle Crown, Scepter, Golden Crown, lacking genealogy, descent, or natural myths. By the way, in ancient Romanity, even though everybody descended from him in a way or another, the concept of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was so totalizing and so superior and so absolute that his entire power was just even incomparable to a simple connection with mankind. And this was actually done through other, there are other metaphors, other means. For example, the ruminus, the ficus ruminalis, for example, is the one that nourishes literally Romulus and Remus as they arrive in Rome with the little boat, and it aligns with the same Mars as much as the she-wolf nourishes after having come down from the hill, just like the war bands training this new initiates, the twins that also themselves represent the white and the black, the Dioscuri and the necessary sacrifice of the lower, right? So there, for example, you see how the ruminus of Jupiter is connected also with the martial connection as the Holy Ghost, because he's truly the one who augments from augere, from which also Sebastos comes from in Greek. It was the prerogative of the Augusti, of the imperatores, who truly augmented themselves in a divine sense. So actually the Trinity is a radically important in this meaning. If you lack that, what kind of knowledge can you have of Roman religion? Mars, for example, was tied to horses as well. There were the Equiria rites starting at the Tiber with sword-embedded turning posts. This started from the chthonic dimension because, as we'll see now, this was the race towards heaven from the lowest chthonic dimension. There was the sacrifice of the same victorious horse at the end. There was all a mechanism also of again, the arrival and the type of weapons with which the horse was killed. There were, again, Mars was, for example, invoked during the sacred dances by the Luperci. So with the reference to the wolves, and this sacred brotherhood, a bit like the berserkers essentially. The Arvalists were the literal equivalent of the Celtic druids in Rome, and with the invocation, quote, help us Mars dance, dance. Right, and this had to do notoriously with the frenetic dances of the Dionysian trances that were shamanically induced in the steps to just from this lower etheric, frenetic, lower tonic dimension to elevate yourself towards something higher after the initiation, warfare, and bloodshed, etc. Now, because the wolf naturally is the last of, eventually you become the eagle. You rise to some other aspect. The wolf is a gregarian. At least there is the head of the wolves, but that is also the divine. The one who really elevates and takes on an ever more manly and divine form. You find the dual aspect as war victory god of Mars, of elemental force, just like Thor Donner, as agricultural patron in Germanic societies as well, among others, because that's just the receiving end, just like as Quirinus fundamentally. Heracles seizing the Amazon queen's Ares, Mars girdle, and Labrus axe, restoring the axe as emblem of supreme authority to the Lydian Heraclids, Philostratus. We talked about this in the Dorian world. Philostratus Heraclitus 1920, Plutarch Quaestionis Graecae 45. The axe naturally connecting Rome with a bit also like the northern world, the civilization of the axe, like the battle axe culture. We've also made a video connecting that with the Vedas and the cardinal points of Indo-European, and in theory, like at that point also Atlantean origin, Hyperborean one, even before that, for that matter. But we'll get there in some video, because this is all well-founded in tradition, and it's not just a mere hypothesis people want to scientize or to misunderstand from its highly spiritual background. Quirinus represented finally the unconquered aspect claimed by Caesar, as in Dio Cassius 43-45 is stated, from an early period, so meaning that Caesar himself was the achieving son, right? What about you parallel Caesar with Christ in the Trinity? Because that's literally what happened to fix the world, to restore sin, to cleanse the res publica from the sin of the civil war and common bloodshed. What does Christ do for mankind? Right? You literally understand that this was an act. I mean, Dio Cassius says that. It's not like the Christians said that later, right? In a strange, this was not obviously even accepted by the Christians if not maybe in a very latus sense, considering the relations of the church with the emperor and so on. This is what people actually always believed in. If you cross this away from Western civilization, you will never understand anything about it. Right? If you think you are a Westerner, you've never heard of these things, just you've never been a Westerner. And likely, if you're not willing to get this, to study it, to accept it in a deeper sense, you will never be a Westerner. From an early period, Roman sacred life assumed, as we've seen also in our recent video, we were saying before about the state, so just to use modern terminology, assumed a more concrete, less speculative character than Hellenic thought. If anything, Rome conquered the Greeks while they were still conjecturing, and showed them how it's done. The consus Decius Mus exemplified this by devoting himself to the gods in combat. That was a family tradition, also killing your own son. All the various Deci, Mures, the generation. I made a video about the Battle of Suessa, showing you there the value that the Romans attributed to disciplina next to virtus at the same time. In that case, had to be enforced, at least on the subordinate, because the commander was a virtuous, whereas there could be other virtues, but the disciplina that he had to impose from this case, properly to school, to educate, was inherently superior to the sum of them, because he was the medium of God, from which any imperium derived, right? And he could not infringe that sacred law by even letting away his son, go with that knight, with that duel, mounted duel with the Latin knight. And it's similar to what we said before regarding what the Greeks saw that higher wisdom for, that is essentially to rule. You understand how similar they actually are in the end, how at least they stem from the same primigenial motive. And that obviously, thereby guaranteeing Roman victory through his sacrificial act. We will talk more about the devotio, because that's also, a hallmark of, not just of Romanity, but at least that's a high point, also especially from the Roman sagas. Roman religion was intensely political in nature, extending family-based piety into the state as an enlarged sanctified kinship. In other words, the regime as such, from regere, so to hold without imposing, and so successfully nailing that cosmic harmony we were talking about before, was way more important than anyone below, because of course it was the manifestation of the divine on earth, and God is inherently superior to anyone. Ancestral bloodlines and forces were channeled rigorously towards the metaphysical culmination, elevating the powers of the gentes into transcendent realities. Cicero, the illustrious Roman statesman, orator, and philosopher, 106-43 BC, celebrated, for example, civic dedication in the Somnium Scipionis, the dream of Scipio. If you don't, for something how permeated Western civilization was with it, Mozart wrote one of his early operas about this, but nobody cares about it unless you love Mozart. And the Somnium Scipionis is notoriously also part of Cicero's broader work, De Republica, declaring that among earthly affairs, nothing delights the governing God of the cosmos more than just human associations known as states. By the way, for all those who about the Romans were polytheists, they all believed in a sole God. If you believe that BS, you literally failed your entire education. And I don't know how to stress that, right? It's pure, absolute, distillate ignorance, underschooling, and savagery not to know these things. This is literally the ABC of European identity and tradition. You do not know anything of it. It's disgusting. If you don't know, by the way, what's the history of the Somnium, where probably the ancestor speaks to the leader, right? It's properly stated that and described magnificently how the states, the leaders, are preservers. After departing this life, they return to the stars, at least in the moment in which they achieve it. Thus, one should recognize oneself as divine if one feels, remembers, provides, and governs the body, or the universe for that matter, in the manner of the supreme God. You understand how this instantiates the inherent superiority of the ruler, the inherent sacredness of the ruler by human standards. I made, again, multiple videos dedicated to sacred rule in particular. We'll come back on that. There are many, right? There's also beyond the Indo-European world, there's plenty. We've made an entire video about the Far East, like the Chinese idea of heavenly rule. It's very much resonating with the rest. Like it's the same traditional knowledge. Again, everybody knew that across the world. The notion that we're all different religions is wrong, right? It is correct only to the degree they had declined and departed from the original idea. And they're explaining how that had come around is also fascinating, because tradition says something very explicit about that, which contrasts basically with everything that we are normally accepting as having existed just before history, so to say. And patrician lineages in ancient cities employed ceremonial formulas that echoed those of their divine ancestors, those who had made it, and whose deeds had to be imitated once again, right? Commanding the numina as instruments of mystical power. The numen, as you know, is a very beautifully primordial Roman concept in in the Italic archaic religion that stands properly for this immanent force that can manifest if you are truly in cosmic harmony with it, and that it can manifest in human form, as a matter of fact. And so certain leaders are actually the manifestation of that divine power. They're not simply achieving that, but they're also providentially expressing it at a higher level. To largely, this is also the view of tradition. This is shared by Christianity as well, that is, having, in fact, the rest of people come participate to divine power by teaching them how to achieve it, rather than simply transfigure the world in one shot, right? And this is a beautiful idea of the relation between God and man. And at least Cicero in the Harus Picum Responses 1123, Arnobius 431 stresses how effective these rites are solely when they remain unaltered. And naturally, let's not digress on this, but obviously it would always be altered. And as we said before, also every person would have their own way to it. But it's more like the content, probably the tradition of it that matters. All right. Romulus received augural consecration, for example. So this we get from Cicero, the Natura Deorum 3:2. These are incredibly important texts. We should read them entirely at some point, because they tell you how they share, like a Roman of the 1st century BC understood that specific functions of their current religious offices had historically served an all-encompassing and solely divine mean to a comprehensive end, right? They weren't something just out there for no reason, right? Even if it was difficult for St. Romans, obviously, to reason in terms of, when this should have happened back in the day, half of a millennium before or more. Now, the Romans were convinced that divine agencies, also, by the way, because they carried this tradition largely in a behavioral sense. This is true for Rome. Like for Hellas, we have a much greater written idea of what they were thinking and knowing already. And Cicero here is actually very limpid about this knowledge. Once you properly treat it, it's like when you read Livy, that also was fairly modern or secular in the idea that he's not just knowing an overwhelming amount of things that we didn't know, historically speaking, because his sources are unknown, unfortunately, but that he could give a specific sort of vest, even into this later fashion, as to preserve the original meaning and mechanism. We've seen it in the video about the foundation of Rome, according to Livy. The Romans were convinced that divine agencies had founded Rome's grandeur and upheld her eternal character, the aeternitas, right? Cicero explains this in the De Natura Deorum 238. Also Plutarch in Romulus 1:8, for that matter. And think how even, again, these figures could be, even in the Hellenic world, etc., still an object of debate. So much later in time, their historical, sort of their mythical reality. Cicero affirmed that, quote, antiquitas proxime accedit ad Deus, in De Legibus 2:11. So that he stressed essentially the connection, this primordial times with divinity. There's no doubt. And also the value of history. As you know, Cicero was big about that, like the ultimate purpose, right? Why did he say that not knowing history, what happened before you were born, is to remain a child forever, right? Because you're essentially involved. You're essentially unaware of the broader meaning and potential of life. And this very much applies to people today. Cicero condemned occupations catering to sexual indulgence. In the De Officiis 142, for example, think about how the Romans had banned the bacchanalia at some point, because yes, they were tolerated as long as they were, again, kept under, but when we're becoming obsessive, like the stern, rigid, authoritarian, patriarchal Roman Morris had to simply put that down. In the Roman context, the divine does not oppose the human sphere either. On the contrary, but emerged organically through the maturation of personality, elevating personal destiny to the level of fatum. Right? The Romans truly believed and were much closer again to the primigenial sense of divine transcendence compared to the Greeks, where manifest rule and the same Roman imperium that took over the entire world was that derived from probably this greater closeness naturally of the Roman people specifically, but still of mankind, to divinity. It was more easily accessible. With militarized people like the Romans, this was kind of obvious because religion was baked into the warlikeness of this all. It's a holy, sacred as much as military as is warlike. Franz Altheim, the 20th century German historian of ancient religions, 1898-1976, look at the parallelism with Dumézil, for example, known for works like A History of Roman Religion in 1938, perceptibly contrasted Hannibal's brilliant yet trenchant so-called demonic brilliance with Scipio's gradually developed providential quality. Right? Carthage had to rise as an aspis in order to be crushed by the Roman eagle, just also in the alchemical symbol for that matter. It's not a coincidence. We'll talk more and better how Rome properly inverted the axis of the fall and restored the golden age in Europe and the Mediterranean. And this is not much of, again, an anecdote of divine favor, such as, for example, the silent dogs at Jupiter's temple upon Scipio's approach, but primarily from Scipio's profound capacity to incarnate Roman destiny, which is actually the law of the providence of the hero himself. In that case, truly crushed Carthage, or at least tamed it, because, as you know, that was wiped out only in the Third Punic War, but in this sense showed against this terrible enemy. I mean, his father had been killed at war against the Carthaginians. He had suffered enormously. The entire point was about crushing, taming Carthage, but not wiping it out, not eradicating it. On the contrary, he was very opposite with that, because he understood also how he personally could control that, and the Roman Senate, as you know, persecuted him and finally exiled him. And therefore, the Roman hero directs the providential currents of history. Right? You understand how these features laid crucial groundwork for later understandings of Roman religious awareness. Again, when you study, for example, later probably imperial literature, realize that especially theological texts, the Christian ones, were all referring largely about this. They were also openly talking about what, for example, heresies derived from certain Chthonic Pelagian dimensions, as opposed to Christianity that instead pursued actually a patriarchal. Like, you have all these lesser people nowadays everywhere that think that Christianity is feministic. If you are a lesser person, if you are feministic yourself, you think that Christianity is feministic. And most foretestators who think to cosplay as Nazis are actually feministic or socialistic or lesser people. There's no way around that, right? And that's why they need to lie and to act, which is archetypally what probably the Pelagian element of the Great Mother does, because they are radically underschooled, they have no capacity, they do not care about anything other than deflecting the fact that they're lesser people. But they do not understand that tradition pierces with its gaze right through them. And that's why they burn under that light. And this is what I think this channel is mostly promoting, right? It is to discriminate against those who cannot afford to be. Right? This is incredibly important in a truly European traditional sense. We should reacquire in leadership, in command, in authority, in the right to rule over other people, the God-given right to do so. This is incredibly important. Essentially the right today is basically populism, it's socialism, it's near communism, as a matter of fact. We're witnessing it very well, especially in the last years of online, like with what the quote-unquote right, that it's not right, it has nothing to do with that. right? A person who does not these things cannot, again, should not even be given voting rights, should not be accepted as a European. It's useless, right? What kind of views can a person like this have? It must be out and must understand that to be re-accepted after a pretty heavy testing to be part of Europe. If you don't know these things, you can't be part of that. It's useless, right? But let's say when we talk about the stuff, it's always pleasant, important. I also heavily despise people who just watch these videos and don't watch the others, because they don't understand that they can't understand this without the rest and vice versa. But again, the mentally fragile always leans towards that feebleness, that weakness in terms of properly the incapacity, the connaturated, as the ancients truly believed, it's the connaturated incapacity to understand complex thinking, higher ideas, authority, divine mandate. If you lack these, it's done, right? And for that matter, again, there is a vast literature, as also these videos sort of start poking at, because here, this is the groundwork. This is laying properly the first stones of the pathway to the full understanding of tradition. If you're not willing to, again, understand this, how many videos did I make about this stuff? Hundreds already. I think we have gotten into that range. Again, you can't understand this video alone from standard education, unless you're, again, extremely dedicated. You've done something extremely similar to what it happened to be my path. So to put it in this way, not to flatter myself too much, simply saying, okay, look, this stuff is there, this is accessible. It's not like nobody can know that. I disclose, I explain, whatever. Like, if you want to understand it, good. Otherwise, it's your problem. Again, I happen to come here, can't say by chance, but still with a specific degree of sort of awareness, through at least a specific curiosity, will to explain, and so on. If you click on my videos just because of the thumbnails and you're not able to understand even what is said in the first minute, and then go around claiming things that you don't even understand when preferred by yourself about what you would have allegedly understood, it's your problem. You're just shooting your own foot. You're also making me a favor for that matter, because I gain visibility and notoriety for that. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.